All right, welcome back, everybody. We're going into the second part of the notes on Chapter 8, Varieties of American Nationalism. Today we're going to focus on a really important event in our country's history because it's something that's going to lead us ultimately to civil war, the Missouri Compromise. So we'll talk about that as well as the first major economic downturn in our country's history, which we'll talk about here shortly. So, anyway, remember test on Monday, packet due Monday. If you have any questions during the notes here, just ask to pause or whatever, and we can go over or rewind or do whatever we need to do to make sure that we understand everything. So let's get right after it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the Missouri Compromise. And you already know when you include that word compromise in something, people on both sides aren't going to be totally happy. So to get to this, let's kind of talk about, kind of where we are in regards to slavery. So slavery has grown in the United States. A lot of people thought that it was something that was just going to kind of work its way out of the system. A lot of people continue to believe that. And then Eli Whitney has to go and invent the cotton gin, which kind of doubles down the need for slavery in the United States in the South because you know to produce the cotton and the use of the cotton gin, you need slaves to pick the cotton, and now we're sending cotton all over the world. Okay, and that's a big money maker for the South, so they appreciate that, and because of that, they need to continue the existence of slavery. You also have, as another reason, kind of as a side reason, there's that feeling that Southerners have that the North is always trying to mess with their style of life. And like I noted on Monday in class, how we're seeing folks in the North start to move further and further away from slavery and start to support abolition. The folks in the South kind of hunker down and say, no, we got to keep slavery because that's really important to our economy. And because of that, the folks in the South really start to be more vigilant about wanting to create and expand the practice of slavery to as many places as possible. Okay, so we start off with 13 states. Did you know that? Oh yeah. So we start off with 13 states, of course, and slavery is either an issue that isn't talked about or is straight up legal in places, expected, but of course the places in the North don't have slavery as much. Okay, so this is where territorial expansion gets kind of tricky. So since the original 13 colonies, we've added Tennessee, slave state, Kentucky, slave state, Ohio, Ohio, awesome state, Louisiana, slave state, Alabama, slave state, Indiana, as it turns out, kind of racist, but not a slave state. Vermont, not a slave state. Illinois, not a slave state. And Mississippi, a slave state. So that is 5 slave states have been added, and 4 non-slave states have been added. So here we are with 13 plus 9 new states, so that's 22, and we're sitting at 11 free states and 11 slave states. And that's going to be really important when we come to the concept of the Missouri Compromise. Terrible line there. Okay, so that's the status of slavery in these new areas. It's kind of 50-50. The Southerners want more slave states because as soon as you start to have a lot more free states, the Southerners are afraid that the Northerners are going to legislate out slavery, okay, especially as the push for abolition grows. Again, this is the period we call the antebellum South. That's a big term, antebellum, lady antebellum. Basically, what antebellum South means is the South prior to the Civil War. So whenever you see the term antebellum South, which the AP loves to use, it is a reference to the South prior to the war. Okay, so the status of slavery in these new areas is, 50-50. Half of them have slavery, half of them don't. And I just marked over slavery there. So let's erase that. Yeah, technology. All right. So that's where we are with this. So what's going on here? Okay. So it comes time to add state number 23, which is Missouri. Big ups to Connor Bazelak. Big game last weekend. Let's keep it going. Go Knights. Anyway, so James Tallmadge comes up with an amendment, not an amendment to the Constitution, but a proposed bill that would add Missouri as a free state. Now all of a sudden this is going to tip the balance of slave states and free states to favor the North. But Tallmadge takes it a step further and says we don't want to increase the practice of slavery. Tallmadge is, of course, a Northerner and against slavery, and wants to propose a plan towards gradual emancipation of slaves. So towards the end of slavery. So understandably, the people in the South freak out. Everybody's like, oh, we're going to leave the country. We're going to have war. We're going to blah, 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 do this and that, all these things. And we need to find a way to fix this situation. All right. By the way, this is the year 1820. What the heck? That was disgusting. 1820. Yeah, that was way better. And so here we go with another major compromise. The Compromise of 1820 is it's sometimes called, or more commonly called, the Missouri Compromise. All right? So again, when we're talking about compromise, it's a situation where neither side is completely appeased by the decision. But ultimately, compromise is going to avert a bigger crisis. So the Missouri Compromise is as follows. Okay? I'll give you a second to kind of get caught up there. 1. So the Missouri Compromise is as follows. Missouri will be entered into the Union as a slave state. Okay? But now you say, well, the North doesn't have, now the North has fewer states, free states, and the South has more, right? 12 slave states to 11 free states. The agreement in the Missouri Compromise is that Missouri will be entered in as a slave state, and they're going to fast track Maine to be entered in as a free state. That way you keep the balance of free to slave states the same. Okay? So you add one on each side. Now you got 12 free, 12 slave states. Everybody's happy with that. The other part of the agreement to appease the Northerners is that there will be no more slavery above the 3630 parallel. So the 3630 parallel, which essentially that is the southern border of Missouri. So no more slavery north of the southern border of Missouri, except for Missouri because we're going to enter that as a slave state. So all that land that we acquired through the Louisiana Purchase, and ironically I'm using LSU colors in our slides today, so that's nice, or Bellbrook colors, or my high school's colors, Lakewood High School, go Rangers, or Lakers colors, they just won a title. So yeah, anyway. So what that means is no more slave states north of the southern border of Missouri. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And I'll show you in a map here in a minute. All that land from the Louisiana Purchase north of that southern border of Missouri will have to be free. Okay? All the land south of the southern border of Missouri that hasn't been made a state yet, that will be open to slavery. And that's an important distinction. Okay? Everything north of that 3630 parallel has to be free. Everything south of it, open to slavery, which means it can have slavery, but it doesn't have to. Okay? Southerners are happy because they get a slave state. Northerners are happy because they get a free state and they get slavery officially illegal in new territory. And the Northerners can live with the slavery still being open in the South because they figure, well, we'll just flood in and put people in there, and then we won't have to worry about it becoming slavery because popular sovereignty will determine it and everything will be fine. At least that's what they think, okay? So this is a big compromise that's going to have real serious ramifications later on as we get closer to the Civil War and more attempted compromises, okay? So who is the person behind the compromise? This is somebody I talked about last chapter, who I said is going to play a big role in pretty much every important political decision made between now and about 1850, and that is Henry Clay. In case you don't know how to spell Henry Clay, this won't help you at all. So Henry Clay is the person behind the compromise. He comes out with, this idea, of north of the southern border of Missouri and the open territory for slavery, et cetera, et cetera. The crisis is averted. Everybody is essentially happy, and we're able to move on without, having a major blow up, which could lead to a civil war that is going to happen 40 years before it actually does, right? So it's important to note this is the first important political compromise since we've had the Constitutional Convention. And as you should know by now, compromises aren't always great things. The Great Compromise during the Constitutional Convention, that worked out well. This one, it's a Band-Aid. It's a temporary fix. It's certainly not going to solve the problem, and we'll find that out in the long run, especially once we get to about Chapter 13 and everything falls apart. So, what issues will this decision cause later on? I kind of already mentioned that. We're going to have other compromises later. There's going to be other questions about the 3630 parallel and whether that's constitutional or not, and whether or not the government has the power to tell territories before they become territories whether or not they'll be allowed to have slavery. Okay, states' rights versus national power issue, they're presented again. So we're seeing all kinds of the issues that I've been telling you about over the last several days play a role again. Here we go back to cause and effect. I know we always talk a lot about cause and effect, right? So we have a very present problem here in determining slave versus free in Missouri. We come up with a solution for that, but it's a solution for that. It's a solution for Missouri that's going to keep everybody in the country happy and maybe get that air of good feelings to last a little bit longer, but it's not really. So what it's going to cause, of course, are other compromises down the way, issues regarding slavery, and ultimately things that are going to, again, lead us closer and closer down the path to civil war. Cause and effect. Again, you see that difference between North and South, how they get along, how they don't get along, how they have very different ideologies about economics and social positions and political ideologies too. The North and South are becoming clearer and clearer, very different places in this country. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. Maybe it'll make a little more sense on the map here. So here is let's change colors. So here is the Missouri Compromise line. So we add Missouri and Maine, free, slave, and we've got all this territory. All of this territory has to be free. All of this territory, and ultimately all of this territory, will be open to slaves. But at the time, we don't own any of that yet, so that hasn't been worked out yet. Okay, so again, here's that 3630 line. North of it has to be free. South of it, open to slavery. North of the southern border of Missouri. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. This is where the country looks like as of 1820, 1821. Florida's still not a state. Michigan's still not a state. Wisconsin's still not a state. None of this is states. We don't have any of this yet. All right. Okay, so let's move on to another pretty depthful concept. So I'm going to do my best to explain it to you here. And this is economic chaos. So I'm going to tell you a little story, right? Um, which is kind of weird because, yes, you're like, he just said chaos. So let me explain to you why I just said that. So I got this friend named Jim Wacker, a guy I grew up with. He's a mailman. Really is a mailman. He's a good dude. Uh, and so we had this physics day at Cedar Point when I was in high school. So you had to like ride rides and like do physics stuff or whatever. It was stupid. But anyway, so they had this ride called Chaos, and so we're walking around, and it was one of those kind of like standalone rides, like not a roller coaster, one of the ones that kind of just goes in a circle. Um, and so we're walking through by it or whatever, and it had just opened up. And Jim Wacker, my friend, goes, "Hey, what's that new ride, Chaos?" And we look at him like, "What?" He's like, "Yeah, let's try that new ride, Chaos." We're like, "Dude, um, yeah, it's chaos." He's like, "Oh, I don't care. It's just Chaos. Let's try that ride, Chaos." So anyway, we go over to this Chaos, this chaos, and so it's this thing where you ride like two people in a cart, and it's kind of freestanding a little bit, so you can kind of rock it back and forth a little bit to make the ride more exciting or whatever. I don't know. So I go in there with my friend. I got the short straw, and I go in with my friend Rick, who's a big guy, offensive lineman, like 6'7", 330-pound, big dude. And so we're stuffed in there, and we're really rocking this thing back and forth. And we're up at like the top of the ride, at the top point, in the circle, and all of a sudden you just hear this thing go, it's kind of something like that, and the ride stops working. So we're like, yeah, what happened? And it turns out we were rocking the thing so hard that it shut down like the hydraulics and broke the whole ride for the rest of the day. So we had to sit in there for like a half hour, and the guy with like a cherry picker had to come up to get us out of the ride, which was pretty crazy. So I can say that I broke a ride at Cedar Point, which is kind of cool, I guess. So anyway, that's where Chaos comes from. So let's actually talk a little bit about this economic chaos. And of course, whenever there's an economic problem, you have to assume that that means things are bad. So therefore, this is 1819, and we have kind of met the end of the era of good feelings, because the economic prosperity part of that is going to come to a crashing end. So we're going to talk a little bit about an economic panic. They call it a panic basically because everybody freaks out. Okay? Everybody starts losing money. And this is the first serious downturn in American economic history. First major economic downturn in American history. Okay? So that's what happens in the Panic of 1819. Now, why does this happen, and how does the process of panics happen? Because we're going to hear about a lot of them, and they happen about every 20 years. There's Panic of 1819, Panic of 1837. I'll write them up here because I'm sure you won't write them down. 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, 1907, and then the Great Depression, which is like so much worse that they can't even call it a panic. They call it a depression, right? So basically the same thing. So what leads to an economic downturn? There is one simple word that is going to have an effect on all of these, every major economic downturn that we have in our country's history, and that word is speculation. Now, what is speculation when we're talking about economics? Does anybody want to answer that question? Yeah, go ahead. Okay, so I'll explain it then a little bit more. I appreciate that. Maybe you're still talking. If not, it sounds weird, but whatever, I don't care. So speculation is when you assume a value of something is going to be a certain amount, so you invest in it. Okay, um, you speculate on the value of um, gold, we'll say, for instance. So you buy a lot of gold thinking in time it's going to be worth a lot of money, right? For me, let's say when I was a kid, I invested a lot of money in baseball cards, right? And sports cards because I thought they would be worth a lot. Now they're completely worthless. It was not good speculation on my part, okay? But what happens is a lot of people buy and invest in something and assuming that it's going to have a value later on. And when people overinvest in something, then the value doesn't turn out to be what people think it is, and people lose money. Okay, look at the economy. I'm going to give you an analogy for the economy. I don't want to give it to you this way, but I'm going to, right? So the economy in many ways is like a sponge. So imagine a dry sponge and you put it underneath a water, like underneath a sink, and turn the water on. Okay. And you put that sponge under there, and eventually the sponge is going to fill with water. And eventually, when the sponge is completely saturated, the water goes right through the sponge. Okay? The economy works in very much the same way. People invest in a product or a thing in the economy to a point where they invest in it so much that the economy can't sustain it anymore. So in order to make that sponge useful again, what do? You got to wring it out. Okay? That's what an economic downturn, that's what a panic or a depression is. It's a wringing out of the sponge. It gets rid of the stuff it doesn't need and it recorrects itself to become useful and beneficial again. Okay? So that's an analogy for how to look at the economy. So in 1819, the speculation that people were speculating on was land speculation. There's plenty of land out there. People want land, so people start buying tons and tons of land. And a lot of these people buy land on credit from banks thinking they're going to pay it back later. Well, all of a sudden, banks stop giving out as much credit and credit gets what we call tight, meaning there's not much credit being given out. So this is all determined by the National Bank, the Bank of the United States. And they say, okay, it's time for people to pay up on their loans. Well, if I bought a bunch of land and I haven't been able to sell it yet, then I haven't made any money on my investment, right? So therefore, when the banks call me and say, we need the money, I can say, well, I haven't made any money yet and I can't pay you. The banks, therefore, don't have money and they can't give money to people that want loans. Therefore, that leaves the banks without money, and what happens to the banks? They close. And everybody that had their money in those banks loses their money. So nobody has money anymore, and this leads to an economic downturn. I hope that makes sense. So let's run through it one more time, right? So land speculation causes the panic of 1819, right? People buy land. They can't make, people buy land and they buy land on credit, meaning they buy it on a loan. Eventually, the banks tighten credit, which means making credit harder to get, and banks have to start calling in people for their loans. But since I have not sold any of the land or made any money off of it, I can't pay the bank. The bank doesn't have any money, the bank closes. Everybody that had money in the bank then will lose their money as well. It doesn't work that way today because the federal government guarantees the money in your bank up to a certain amount, $250,000, so you can't lose everything. But this is kind of what happens in this particular instance. Okay? I hope that makes sense. And we're going to revisit economic downturns, Panic of 1837, that's also land speculation. When you get to ones around here, it has a lot to do with railroads, but we'll talk about that stuff when we get there. So hopefully that makes sense because these are basic economic principles. This is how money is lost a lot of times. It always has something to do with speculation. Okay, even nowadays, right? When we had the internet boom in the late 1990s, people speculated over the value of .coms. So everybody invested their money in all these different websites and things. and a lot of these websites fail, right? Then a bunch of people lose their money, and we had an economic downturn in 2001, 2002, 2003. Same thing with the housing bubble. Now they use the term bubble to kind of explain things. There was the housing bubble in 2007, 2008. Everybody bought houses on big loans. And then when the banks called in those loans, people didn't have the money to pay it, and we see a bunch of people foreclose on their homes. Commonplace things like this happen. That's the way the economy works sometimes. All right. So again, this is the first major economic downturn in U.S. history, like I said before, and we kind of already talked about what causes an economic panic or a depression. So that is pretty much everything for today. I'll have the last video for you tomorrow that's going to talk about an interesting thing called the corrupt bargain and some political changes, and that'll be it for Chapter 8. Hopefully Tuesday, the stuff we talk about Tuesday in class that's going to be on your test Monday will make more sense now that you've seen it here. So anyway, thanks for listening. I know this went kind of long. I hope all this makes sense. If not, shoot me an email and we'll talk about it more. Chuck Norris. He's coming for you.